How's everybody doing? I am glad that y'all are watching this video. Unfortunately, we cannot have service tonight due to several members of our church getting sick with the Rona, potentially including myself. I'm gotten tested, no results back yet, but definitely keep me in your prayers, keep Shay in your prayers. She did test positive, so we are going to be quarantining for the next week and a half, 2 weeks. So we will be doing online services until we make it through the quarantine. So what does that mean going forward? Well, as far as our Christmas weekend is concerned, that is more than 2 weeks away from today's date. So as of right now, we are still planning on having our Christmas weekend, right, the 18th and the 19th. So we're not planning on canceling that unless we were to get sick again. But as far as we know that ain't gonna happen, right? But we're going to be having, so this coming Sunday morning, we'll be doing another, live service on Facebook, right, at 11 o'clock. And then next Wednesday, we will also be doing an online service like we are tonight. Beyond that, we don't have any other plans. We will keep you guys updated if things change, but that is the plan going for the next couple of weeks. So tonight, as you can probably see through the title, we're going to be talking about the real story of Noah's Ark, part 2, right? Because not this last Wednesday, this last Wednesday, we were talking about the real story of Noah's Ark, and we talked about how, many times the way that we were presented these stories, right, when we were younger, when we were kids in Sunday school, that it was not entirely accurate, right? That it was PG, and so we went into all the details. We talked about everything from the idea that humanity itself is becoming corrupted by fallen angels. We talked about how it was scientifically and logistically possible for Noah and his family to build the ark, and not only that, but for the ark to be filled of 2 of every kind of animal, right? And so I think we had a great discussion last week, and so I wanted to continue that by picking up where we left off. So last week we left off with, right, the size of the ark, animals coming on, how all that could work. And we stopped right at the point, right, where the flood itself occurred. So that's where we want to pick up on tonight, is going from how the flood occurred, going on to what happened after the flood. So that is what we are going to talk about tonight. The real story of Noah's Ark, part 2. Here we go. So part 2 picks up in chapter 7 in Genesis, where the beginning, right, of the flood occurs. And specifically, in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, this is where we see the beginning of the flood occurring. So in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, it says this. It says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, of the 17th day of the month, on that day all of the fountains of the deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened." So I want to focus on that last part. It says, all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. So what a lot of people get wrong about the story of the flood is they are under the impression that it was the rain, right, for 40 days and 40 nights that caused the flood to happen. What's interesting is that the Bible does not start with talking about the rain. The Bible actually starts by describing these fountains of the deep that broke open. So what are these fountains of the deep, right? What does that mean? What is that referring to? Like, scientifically speaking, is that even possible? I mean, right? Because remember in science class, if y'all paid attention, you should have learned about the Earth's layers, right? And how there is several layers underneath the Earth, and they're each increasing in heat and in density until you get to the core. And so the question is, how could there be fountains of the deep, right? Because that we would be thinking like volcanoes or something. But if the whole world is covered in water, then how does the great fountains of the deep, like volcanoes and magma, how does that cover the Earth in water? Well, what's interesting is it's actually not talking about magma in Genesis, it's talking about water. That is to say, the Bible is claiming that there are great fountains, great stores of water underneath the Earth's crust. There are great fountains of the deeps, right? Hiding under the tectonic plates, right? Which, if you don't know what those are, it's because you went to Ferris. But tectonic plates are basically what causes earthquakes, right? When tectonic plates, shift right along or grind along each other, it's what causes earthquakes. Well, underneath tectonic plates, underneath that crust, the Bible is claiming there are great chambers or fountains of water. But is that scientifically accurate, right? Is that possible from a scientific perspective? The answer to that is yes. As a matter of fact, not too long ago, within the last 10 years, scientists have actually discovered a great, fountain of the deep in the Earth's crust. I want to read to you this little bitty clip of an article, right? And I want you guys to take this in. So it says, a reservoir of water 3 times the volume of all of the oceans has been discovered deep beneath the Earth's surface. The finding could help explain where Earth's seas come from. The water is hidden inside a blue rock called ringwoodite that lies 700 kilometers underground in the mantle, the layer of hot rock between the Earth's surface and its core. It says the huge size of the reservoir throws new light on the origin of Earth's water. Some geologists think that water arrived in comets as they struck the planet, but the new discovery supports an alternative idea that the oceans gradually oozed out of the interior of the early Earth. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm reading this, all right, my mind is like working about 100 miles an hour ago. They are literally describing what the Bible is describing in the events of Genesis, the Great Flood, right? Some scientists have supposed or put out there that they think that the Earth got a lot of its water from comets over millions of years hitting the Earth and then leaving behind traces of H2O and whatnot. And I don't know about you guys, but that sounds too much like science fiction to me for me to buy into. But they're saying, but actually, now scientists are thinking, right, that the oceans that we see on the surface today got there by coming from underneath the Earth's crust. And I would like to propose that they are actually absolutely right. But they were right way after the Bible was right, because the Bible itself said the fountains of the deep broke open, right? Beginning the process of flooding the earth, right? So the biggest thing that caused the flood of Noah's Ark was not rain. Rain was involved, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. But it was the fountains of the deep. It's water that was underneath the earth's crust and underneath tectonic plates that broke open, right? That God, through his supernatural judgment, caused a massive, geological change in the earth to where, earthquakes and Lord knows what else was going on, literally, right? To cause this massive breaking open of the earth's chambers, right? Causing massive flooding. There's another thing, and this is more of a freebie, but maybe you've heard of the concept of Pangea, right? And maybe, again, going back to your science class in high school or middle school or whatever it was, this concept of Pangea says that all the Earth's continents used to be one giant landmass, again, millions and millions of years ago. And that slowly, over the course of millions of years, these tectonic plates began to drift away. And that might possibly be true, right? Like, as far as how the mechanics of that work. Might it also be true that massive, rapid breaking open of the Earth's crust could also cause continents to move apart very rapidly within a matter of months rather than millions of years? Something to think about, to put out there for your science teachers to say, hey, it doesn't necessarily need to take millions of years in slow change. This could have happened really, really quick if what the Bible is talking about is true, right? So basically what the Bible is talking about in Genesis is not incompatible, right, with with the scientific ideas we have today. So it's very important that we don't forget that the Bible is not just a book of, theology and talk about God in like the abstract or like sense, but it's also a book of history. It's talking about things that actually occurred that have evidence for them, okay? So that's that. The fountains of the deep broke open, right, causing massive amounts of flooding. And then in verse 12 in chapter 7, and then it says, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So this is where people are getting the rain from. So, of course, there was a lot of rain, right, going on that helped to cause the flood. And we're not just talking about like a light drizzle of rain. We're talking about a massive torrential hurricane-level storm going on potentially globally for 40 days and 40 nights nonstop, right? The great fountains of the deep, water coming up, from the underneath the earth. If that wasn't enough, top that off with a massive hurricane storm, pumping in who knows how many gallons of water in addition to all that, and you have yourself a massive global flood within a matter of a month, right? Completely possible given everything else we just talked about, right? And one thing else I do want to cover is that this flood that occurred in Genesis, this was indeed a global flood. This was not like a flood that just flooded one city, or it flooded one continent, or it flooded one area of the earth. The Bible is very explicit in saying this covered the whole earth, right? This was God's judgment on the entire earth, right? This was not just some flood in a specific area, kind of like what we would see today, right? If a specific city has flooding due to a hurricane or something like that. No, this was a global flood. In fact, it was such a major flood, the Bible actually says that even the tops of mountains were completely covered in water. That's a lot of water. Okay, so the whole earth is flooded, not just a specific area. Some Christians have tried to say, well, no, this was only a flood in a specific place. The Bible is pretty clear. This was a global flood. And in addition to that, this flood lasted for almost an entire year. So from the time the flood started until the time that Noah and his family got off of the ark to walk around, there was actually anywhere from 365 to 370 days. So it was a year-long affair. And when you think about it, right, if you have the whole earth completely covered in water, right, for months and months on end, it makes sense that it would take them a very long time for the ground to finally be dry enough for them to walk on and go about their business, right? Obviously, we would expect that. So far, the floods is what caused, the fountains of the deep, right, underground storages of water is what caused most of the flooding. The science backs it up, right? We, to this day, have massive underground storages of H2O. That's what caused most of the flooding on the earth, right? The 40 days and 40 nights, while it was a lot of rain and a lot of water, that is not by itself what caused the earth to flood. And lastly, this flood lasted for almost a year. From the time it started to the time the earth was completely dry and able to be walked on like it was before. So hopefully you guys have gotten all that information. You got it inside your cranium, inside your head, and we're ready to talk about the next part. So a lot of other questions people have, right, are what happened after the flood, right? Because if this flood was truly, it was global, it was across the whole world, it killed off all life except for the life that was on the ark, 2 of every kind of animal. Remember, not 2 of every species, 2 of every kind, in Noah and his family, then how exactly were they going to survive once they got off the ark? Well, what was interesting is the Bible actually addresses this very thing by talking about food and diets. So I want to read you guys a passage. So in chapter 9 of Genesis, I'm going to read verses 2 and 3 really quick. And this is what God tells Noah right after him and his family leave the ark. He says, "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. And every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." So what's interesting there is God is telling Noah and his family, you are now allowed to eat animals. That's right. So up until this point, humans were actually primarily and maybe even exclusively vegetarian. Fruits, vegetables, plants, right? Anything that you can imagine that grew from the ground is what humans ate. And that was exclusively what they ate for hundreds and hundreds of years leading up to the events of Noah's Ark. And that's important. And the reason that's important is because before the Great Flood happened, you have to understand that the world was still in relatively really good shape, right? God had made the world perfectly according to his design. The human genetic code was perfect, no flaws in it, so humans could live to be a lot longer than we can now. And in addition to that, all of the plant life and all of that was just growing at a rate that we can't even fathom today, right? The hardship of having to grow your own crops and stuff like that wasn't nearly as bad in these early days of the earth as it is for us today. We have to have these complex processes to, grow crops and rotate them and all this other business that only boring farmers care about, right? But back in the day, the earth was almost perfect. So crops were growing a lot better, and so people didn't have a need to actually hunt down and kill animals as a source of food. That's not to say it never happened, but it was probably very unlikely that humans actually ate animals up and until after the flood. And so God says, listen, you are now allowed to eat any animals, right, that you need to survive. And probably a year into the flood, those 2 of every kind of animals probably multiplied into 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 of every kind at this point, right? So, when Noah and his family leave the ark, they now have access to 2 types of food, and that's normal plants, which even though the flood would have destroyed all life on earth, right, the seeds are still going to be there, plants are still going to grow, trees are going to come back, right? It's part of the cycle of life, so plants aren't like gone and never going to exist again. So obviously plants have had some time to grow back, and now animals have had a chance to multiply a little bit. And so God is now saying you have access to multiple kinds of food. So that's how Noah and his family survived after the ark. Which also means, by the way, if humans did not eat each other, that means animals also did not eat each other. Believe it or not, as crazy as that sounds, animals that we know as carnivores today were most likely herbivores back before the flood. Because again, they, like humans, did not need to eat meat. They had plenty of plants and fruits to live off of. What's really interesting, actually, to give you an example of this, is scientists have also recently discovered, again, within the last 10 or so years, that crocodiles, of all animals, crocodiles have a steady diet of fruits and vegetables. Crazy, right? Crocodiles, what we know to be like the modern dinosaur, has a steady diet of fruits and vegetables in addition to its eating meat. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Where did they get that part of their diet from? What point, biologically speaking, did they start eating fruits and vegetables? Well, I don't know. I would maybe argue that's always been there in their DNA, and it was only after the flood, when fruits and vegetables became scarce, that animals and humans began to eat each other as a source of nutrients. I don't know, so that's just something to put out there in case you think it's unbelievable. We have animals that we believe to be carnivores today that still eat fruits and vegetables as part of their diet. So it's very interesting how that traces back to the early days when God first made the earth. So there's that. Again, whole nother big discussion we could get into, but we got more, all right? So another interesting conversation that comes up a lot about Noah's Ark, right? Dinosaurs. What about the dinosaurs? Hey, we can't just ignore the dinosaurs, right? How do the dinosaurs fit into the biblical story, right, of creation and the flood? Where do dinosaurs fit into that, right? Because according to most scientists, they would say dinosaurs lived millions and millions of years ago, before humans existed, and they went extinct long before humans got here, right? If that is the case, then the biblical account may be wrong, right? If the accepted view within most scientific circles is dinosaurs millions of years ago went extinct millions of years ago and humans have never seen them. If that is true, then we might be able to call into question parts of the biblical story. But I'm going to actually argue that dinosaurs were indeed on board the ark. I know you're thinking that, Tyler, that's not possible. But I'm going to explain to you how it is indeed possible. Well, first of all, how could dinosaurs have existed alongside man? Well, we got to deal with that first, right? Because scientists are saying millions of years ago. The Bible is potentially saying only a few thousand years ago at the time of Noah. So which is correct? Which has evidence? Well, firstly, the way scientists have determined that dinosaurs existed millions of years ago is by this process called carbon dating, right? Where they'll go in with their special equipment and they'll date, basically on a molecular level, how old something is, and they'll kind of come up with an estimate of how old they believe fossils are, right? And that's just a very rough way of explaining it, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. But what is interesting is there have been many, many, many different dinosaur fossils over the years that have been discovered that still had soft blood and other tissue on the fossil. Now, if these fossils were millions of years old, it is actually impossible for there to still be soft tissue and meat left over in these fossils. Yet there have been many separate discoveries of fossils with soft tissue, meaning there's no way these fossils are millions of years old. Maybe several thousand, but not millions. That should not be possible. Scientists still don't have an explanation for that. I think the Bible does. And it's that there were dinosaurs that lived alongside human beings. And if you still aren't convinced that it's possible dinosaurs lived alongside human beings, I have another thing to add. So you guys probably know about all these different stories in medieval times of people slaying dragons and all this other stuff about these fire-breathing dragons and all the rest. Well, what's interesting about these stories is that they seem to be more of an exaggeration than an outright lie. Because the Bible actually talks about, in the book of Job, chapter 41, it describes this beast that it calls Leviathan. This massive beast that resides in the water, that when it comes up, it is actually able to breathe out what at least resembles fire. And what's interesting is there's a species of dinosaur that existed that was a water-dwelling creature, and it was able to, from its mouth, release this hot, poisonous acid as a form of self-defense. See a little bit of the correlation there is, I think what's probably likely is that a lot of these old medieval stories of people slaying dragons are probably exaggerations of an actual event that occurred. What I'm saying is it is very likely that humans, as part of the coexisting with these dinosaurs, hunted them down for sport, right? And so in these events of hunting dinosaurs kind of became exaggerated. People began to talk about all this other stuff about, these flying, fire-breathing dragons, which is just an exaggeration of the actual true story of humans coexisting with dinosaurs who now no longer have a steady diet of fruits and vegetables to eat. Now have to turn on other beings, right, to survive. So again, it is very possible and actually very likely that dinosaurs did indeed coexist alongside humans, probably not in a big amount. There probably weren't millions of dinosaurs alive alongside humans, but there was definitely a decent amount, right? There's no way we should be able to find soft tissue and fossils if all dinosaurs are millions of years old. That's just not possible, right? So there has to have been some coexistence with humans, and there's definitely at least claims and eyewitnesses throughout history who have claimed to have seen these beasts. Oh, on one final note on that, the word dinosaur was not invented until the 1800s. Before we had the word dinosaur, people would call fossils of dinosaurs, they called them dragons. That's just something else to consider. Okay, so moving on from dinosaurs. I hope you guys have found some fascination and interest in this story of Noah. I mean, there's obviously so much more we could talk about, but I think we've covered probably all the main bases about this story and about the details and the facts that you probably weren't told, right, when you were in Sunday school. But there is so much more we could talk about. There's so much more. I would love to sit here for about 4 or 5 hours and go over every last piece of evidence that's out there for the flood, for dinosaurs coexisting with man, for everything else. So there's so much we could talk about. But I know you guys are not going to sit here and watch a 4-hour video on YouTube about that. So instead, there is a website that I want to recommend to you guys for further study, and it's called AnswersInGenesis.com. This is a Christian website, and it is made up of a team of scientists, and their job is to go and study the different parts of the Bible, right, specifically Genesis, and they find and present scientific evidence for the Bible's claims of creation, for the Bible's claims of the flood and all the rest. And they put out some really interesting evidence for the biblical story of our creation and the flood, and even going beyond that. So definitely check out AnswersInGenesis.com or .org. I can't remember. I'm going to put the link right here. Okay, .com or .org, I don't even remember, but you'll have it here. Go there and do some research. You can just type in flood, Noah's Ark, and all the rest, and they have article after article after article answering all these different questions you could have, presenting evidence that I didn't even present here. A lot of really interesting studying. But I hope that I definitely want to continue the series, the real story, right? We can go into David and Goliath. We can go into there's really no limit on the amount of biblical stories that we can give the real story on, right? That we can give the extra details that you were not given in Sunday school. But I hope you guys learned a lot. I hope you guys were blessed from this, and I hope this provokes some interesting conversation with your friends or in your science class or whatever it may be. Next time you have your teacher up there saying, it would took millions of years for these dinosaurs to go extinct and all this other stuff, and you go, hey, but isn't it also possible, right, that there was a big flood and all this other stuff? Hey, I'll let you figure out how you want to talk to your teachers and friends, but at the very least, you got some interesting stuff to have a conversation about. So I'm going to dismiss us in a word of prayer, and hopefully you guys have a great rest of your week, and hopefully you guys have a great December, and we are going to have a great Christmas. All right, so bow your heads, close your eyes. Dear God, thank you so much for this day. And God, I just want to thank you for allowing us to be able to study your word and to kind of go into more detail and go into more depth, pun intended, about the Noah's Ark and the Great Flood. God, there's so much here that I think that we need to study more, God, that I think that we need to think about, we need to pray about, and God, we need to talk to other people about. God, these are conversations that are fascinating, that are interesting, and that have the ability to draw people into wanting to know more about the Bible, and then eventually wanting to know more about you. So God, help us as Christians to study our Bibles carefully, to read it, and to not just look at it as a book of theology, but God, it's a book of history. It's a book of facts. It's a book of what actually happened. God, help us to treat it that way, and to read it with reverence, to read it with awe and wonder, and to know that we can have confidence, God, that your word is true, your word is reliable, and it's not just a bunch of fairy tales, God. It is an accurate account of what you have been doing with humanity since you have created it. And so, God, help us to love your word just like we love you. And in Jesus' name, amen.